Ladies and gentlemen, we have more news as it relates to Super Micro Computer and their struggles to file their annual and quarterly report. Into the channel today, we have news that Super Micro Computer has requested additional time to file its 10Q annual report as the company continues to search for an auditor. This follows the fact that the company has asked to extend its deadline to file its annual report. That also been granted by the major exchanges and the SEC, and the company has until the end of December to not only find an auditor, file an annual report, and file first quarter report as well. What are the odds the company actually does this? We'll discuss, and we'll discuss some major news that the company has troubles potentially with one of their major lenders and the penalties associated with the fact that the company is now in major financial trouble. We'll have to discuss this given the fact that shares of Super Micro Computer continue to trend lower. In fact, over the past month, shares of Super Micro down 56%. Just over the past 5 days, shares of Super Micro down nearly 20%. This has become one of the most shorted large cap stocks, and one of the reasons why we're paying attention to this stock, because if it can get its act together, you could have one of the greatest American turnaround stories of all time, considering the fact that you're trading at just a single digit forward price to earnings multiple on this. Again, given the fact that the company hasn't filed audited financials in 2 separate quarters, it brings into the question whether you can believe the financials. But if you do, you've got a single digit price to earnings multiple on this one, and also a potential short squeeze, given the fact it's one of the most shorted stocks in the stock market. Now, some things to understand, because as I go through the comment section of my videos and as I have discussions with investors in Supermicro, a lot of people are confused about the situation. Now, a couple of things to understand. The company has 2 main requirements as it relates to financial earnings reporting with not only shareholders, but the indexes in which the shares are traded on. And so most pressing for the company is to file quarterly reports every 3 months with investors, typically hold a conference call as well, and eventually come out with an audited set of results, which tends to come maybe a week or 2 after the actual announcements of those results. Those come in what's called a 10Q filing, and the company today asked for additional time to file these reports as they continue to try to find a new auditor. Again, this comes on the heels of the fact that they file a 10K annual report. This is a once a year report, which does have lots of financials, but more importantly, in the 10K annual report, you get things like risk factors, all types of disclosures that don't typically happen on a quarterly basis. The company will be required to answer and follow up on a lot of the questions that were raised by that Hindenburg report, which was launched maybe a month or 2 ago. Earlier this month, just a couple of weeks ago, the company asked to extend the deadline to deliver their annual report until December 31st. They've just requested a similar deadline to file their 10Q report as well. So far, the NASDAQ exchange, which Supermicro Computer stock is listed on, has played ball and has allowed the company this extension. That is typical with companies unless there's just blatant fraud that is already proven in a court of law. In the case of Supermicro, most of this fraud is still alleged. Now, the company, though, has borrowed some money and it has some bank debt on their balance sheet. So it's not just NASDAQ and individual shareholders that are concerned that Supermicro Computer cannot produce a set of financials. Probably the most concerned is a bank that has lent Supermicro Computer about $600 million. This bank is called Cathay Bank, and they are the lender of this money to Supermicro Computer. Now, earlier last month, the company formed an amendment to their loan terms. And interestingly enough, inside of this amendment is something particularly interesting, and I think goes to show the financial troubles that Supermicro Computer could potentially be under. The company now has financial covenants, which is basically means financial rules that Supermicro Computer has to follow. Part of that is maintaining a certain amount of cash balance sheet over at Supermicro, so this lender feels comfortable that they could potentially be paid back the $600 million that they've loaned the company. What's interesting is now maintaining at all times an aggregate cash amount of not less than $150 million and not less than $30 million should be maintained at the lender. So the lender that loaned Super Microcomputer about $600 million is now requesting a large percentage of that to actually be held in cash on the company's balance sheet, and $30 million of it should just be maintained in a bank account at the bank that has loaned the money to Super Microcomputer. This is a bad sign, a terrible sign for Super Microcomputer, that its lenders is requiring the company to maintain about 5% of the total amount that they've lent them in a cash account. Now, when the company announced early Q1 results, really just in text form, they said that they had $2.1 billion of cash and cash equivalents with about $2.3 billion of bank debt. So if you take these values at face value, the company could easily set aside $150 million with $30 million holding at this bank and still be well within the expectations that the bank has laid out. But also inside of here are penalties, where if Super Microcomputer is not able to deliver not only on the financial covenants, but potentially filing those annual reports and quarterly reports, they will face fines and damages of up to $2 million or more, no later than 5 business days after the last day of each month. So this company could be in major trouble, not only with shareholders with different types of lawsuits that are coming there, potentially getting delisted from the NASDAQ, which we'll talk about here more in a moment, but also from the lender as well. All of this brings into question, does this company have enough time to not only select a new auditor? Because based on the filing that we saw today, the company has barely even engaged a new auditor, let alone has hired one. And keep in mind, the month of November has multiple holidays for the Thanksgiving holiday. And then as you move into Christmas as well, you have multiple holidays for not only Christmas, but for New Year's as well. I'm assuming an auditor probably could pay staff overtime in order to get these things done. But now that we are just less than 60 days away from the end of the year, can Super Micro not only get an auditor to sign off on a 10Q quarterly report, but can they find an auditor to sign off on an annual report as well? Both of that seems like a very tall task, just given the time frame that we have, but also factoring in that you have 2 major United States holidays getting in the way of some working time. Now, what could potentially happen with Super Microcomputer if they're not able to file these quarterly reports? Well, eventually they're going to get delisted from the NASDAQ exchange. The NASDAQ exchange, also the S&P 500 inclusion, does not have time for companies that can't file their quarterly and annual reports on time. So they're essentially kicked off of the exchange and they're moved to what's called the over-the-counter market, or sometimes also called the pink sheet. Over-the-counter trades take place on decentralized exchanges with broker deals. Now, this is not like crypto where it's an exciting thing to be on a decentralized exchange. In order to have liquidity in your stock and have it be traded on the Robinhoods, the Charles Schwabs, the Fidelity apps, you tend to have to be traded on a centralized exchange like the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ. Over-the-counter stocks tend to be penny stocks that happen to be delisted as well. It could be international stocks as well that don't want to follow different types of reporting rules to get onto the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. It also has some bonds and some derivatives. So there is some liquidity on the over-the-counter markets, but what can happen is that if you have these shares held inside of a broker account that does not have access to these decentralized exchange, well, there could be a lot of pain for you in store for Super Micro. Now, from a technical perspective, this is an absolute falling knife. And to steal a comment left on one of my Super Micro computer videos earlier, this is not a falling knife. This is a falling chainsaw. And so you do not want to step into this. This is like jumping onto the tracks of an incoming train or running out into the major Highway 5 freeway here in California. Nobody would do that. Only an amateur investor would jump in here on Super Microcomputer when you've printed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 very steep red candles in a row. Now, more importantly, though, we've blown through a series of consolidation between $22.85 and up to about $35 per share on this one. This was acting as support. We've just now blown through that. I think we're coming down here to what's considered a long-term trend. This is assuming you don't go over the counter on super microcomputer. I think we're coming down here to a longer-term trend line, which is represented by this purple line. If it happens in the short or medium term, you're getting down to about $10 per share on this one. Now, it could end up being one of the great turnaround stories in the history of the stock market, but the company has less than 60 days to find an auditor that will not only go through the company's financials, but also use that company's and that auditor's good name to actually sign off on these things. That is a very short period of time to not only file a quarterly report, but also an annual report, which is far more comprehensive. And obviously, you have Ernst Young, which was not willing to do that. Believe it or not, there are very few auditing firms in the United States. So if Ernst Young is not willing to do that, the list of auditors that this company has already engaged with is an extremely short list. The fact that they have not been able to find another auditor is not a good sign. Personally, I think the odds of this company going over the counter and getting delisted are far higher than a comeback. That was Super Microcomputer stock, giving you an update for today, Wednesday, November 13th. I'll be back this weekend to recap any further news on Super Microcomputer, but also any other semiconductor industry news, as we do on the Semiconductor Show every weekend here on Equity Empire. Thanks for tuning in today, and good luck with your investments.